He's the grieving Muslim father who has shaken the Donald Trump presidential campaign to its very core. I'll speak to Khizr Khan. I'm Mehdi Hasan. Also on the show, are critics of the Indian government being censored? That's our debate featuring the author of a controversial new book that implicates Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the Gujarat massacres of 2002. But first, it was the heartbreaking moment that has come to define and dominate the US presidential campaign.
You have sacrificed nothing and no one.
This week's headliner, Khizr Khan, the Muslim-American lawyer from Pakistan whose son died serving in Iraq and who grabbed the world's attention when he denounced Donald Trump's bigotry at the Democratic National Convention. Thanks for joining me on UpFront. You lost your 27-year-old son, Humayun, killed in Iraq, protecting his fellow soldiers from a car bomb. You have since accused Donald Trump of dividing Americans, of demonizing Muslims, while, quote, sacrificing nothing and no one. Trump says you're wrong, you have no right to comment, and that he has made sacrifices similar to yours. What do you say to him?
I say what I said to him earlier. He is so unaware. I have, under the Constitution of this country, I have the same rights to criticize him as he has the rights to criticize others. He forgets that part. That is the tragedy in his candidacy, that he is totally unaware of the equal rights that this country, this Constitution grants.
Are you surprised, astonished at how big a part of this presidential election campaign you and your wife have become? You're a Muslim immigrant from Pakistan. Did you ever imagine that you would take to the Democratic convention stage and not only be given an opportunity to speak, but speak in such a way that you are dominating news headlines both nationally and globally a week later?
We are private citizens. We love our privacy, peace and quiet with family and children. I was not expecting that. But I tell you this, on the streets, any place that I go, people come to say thank you what you have said. They give me hug. Not only hug, when I look into their eyes, I see glimmer of hope and tears in their eyes. There had not been a person who has met me had not had tears in their eyes. And the reason is not the speech or the person or the Khizr or that, not at all. The despair that this candidate has created among minorities, especially Muslims, that had been repudiated. He does not have any moral. Today, President Obama, first time in the history of this country, he said this candidate is unfit to be the president of the United States.
So you have no regrets about what you've done since the speech. Trump said on Monday that what bothered you, he said, is that he wants to stop so-called Islamic terrorists from coming into the US, whereas you, he thinks, don't. One of his close advisors has called you an agent of the Muslim Brotherhood. Were you expecting this line of very personal attack on you when you decided to speak out against him?
These are demagogues. These lines, these words are pandering for vote. These are fear-mongering terms and words because they have nothing better to offer except fear-mongering. And luckily, there is enough time. Folks are figuring it out that that is not the case. I am against violence as any decent American or citizen of this world would be.
You have suggested that the United States is the greatest country in history, and yet up to 45% of the American people still say they're going to vote for Donald Trump in November to be their commander-in-chief, regardless of how bigoted or racist he is, how crassly or crudely he behaves. Those are your fellow Americans. That must shock you.
It certainly does. But in history, if you know when countries make mistakes, fear-mongering, demagoguing, pandering for vote, countries, nations have made mistakes. History is full of those mistakes. And I am certain that American citizens are not going to buy the snake oil that he is selling.
Your son Humayun's grave has become a shrine at Arlington Cemetery in recent days. People leaving flowers, cards, well-wishers turning up. How do you feel, not just when you see that scene, but when you hear politicians from across the political spectrum, from Hillary Clinton to Senator John McCain, saying your son represented the best of America?
I am encouraged. I am delighted that they are recognizing. But we had known that all along, that he was the best. He received his education here. Army trained him. But inside there was a son of an immigrant Muslim family, decent human being, deliberate human being, caring human being, and rest is evident. Everyone is acknowledging his qualities.
And if your son Humayun, who died a hero aged 27 in Iraq in 2004, protecting his fellow soldiers, if he was alive today, what do you think he'd be saying to you?
He'll be standing right here with his hand on my shoulder.
Supporting your mission?
Every which way.
Some Muslims, they worry that in the current climate, there are brave soldiers or police officers, members of the armed forces who are Muslims, and they're very proud of them. But they also worry that there are other Muslims who aren't part of the armed forces, who aren't interested in joining the military, don't support American wars abroad. And they worry that in the current discourse, there's this division into good Muslims who support American defense, security, wars, and bad Muslims who don't. Bill Clinton said at the convention last week, if Muslims hate terror, then they should stay in America. That's not a helpful attitude, is it?
Yeah, what is missing in this discourse is that we Muslims in the United States have not prepared ourselves adequately to participate in the discourse. There is lots of misconceptions. Education has little to do with that, meaning that these are educated people, these are political leaders. They really have not been groomed properly to understand Muslims, understand Islam in United States. That's our responsibility. Even if we start today, it will not be too long.
But you would accept that a young American Muslim man who doesn't join the American military, who thinks the American military does bad things abroad, for example, is still as patriotic and is still as part of America as anyone else?
Of course, of course. That is where the outreach has to be conducted. That is why I speak, because Donald Trump touts excluding people. That is not patriotic solution. Not everybody has to wear uniform to be called patriot.
You said in a recent interview on MSNBC that US wars in the Middle East have not been, quote, in the interest of the United States and have created chaos and a quagmire. Your son obviously died tragically while serving in Iraq, very controversial war. Do you think, personally, the Iraq war was a mistake, that it was wrong, as many people do?
I will cite General Colin Powell at Harvard in one of the symposium. The very first words that came out of General Colin Powell's mouth was, "I am sorry, I apologize." And that says it all, that was a mistake that has not served American interest well, and the results are there. There are better ways to handle the difficulties and the disputes and the foreign policies, but that definitely has proven to be a mistake.
Back in 2003, you didn't support going into Iraq?
Not at all.
And what about Hillary Clinton, whose convention you spoke at? A lot of Muslims in the US and around the world have a lot of concerns, fears, worries about her candidacy and what her presidency might look like. They say that she's been very harmful to Muslims in many ways. They point to the Iraq War, which she supported and voted for, Libya, which is now a kind of mess, a disaster. They point to her support for Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu's very right-wing leadership of Israel. Those are legitimate criticisms of her, aren't they? You understand those concerns. You must hear them from your fellow American Muslims.
Of course. She supported, but it was the Republican Party's starting and doing of the Iraq War. As a strong leader of this country, Hillary Clinton has much more balanced policies than the Donald Trump of Republican Party. Any day I will support Hillary Clinton. If I criticize Hillary Clinton on her policies, it is received well. The person who criticizes is not condemned. On the other hand, there is a person that has no empathy at all, no hope.
I interviewed General Michael Hayden, former head of the CIA, on this show, and sitting where you're sitting, he said that he believes that Donald Trump is basically acting as a recruiting sergeant for groups like ISIL. His rhetoric actually helps boost these extremist groups who Trump supporters have tried to link you to. Do you share that view?
I share that view. I add to that is that Donald Trump is incapable of understanding that consequence. He is incapable intellectually and mentally. His behavior had been proof of that. And these are senior policy makers that are alarming us that this is the danger that is headed this way.
In the specific case of ISIL as well.
Exactly.
One final question. In a typically shameless and offensive statement, ISIL this week called your late son an apostate. As not just a proud American, but a proud Muslim, what is your message to ISIL, to the so-called Islamic State?
That is perverted version of Islam. Islam has nothing to do with this kind of violence. Who are the most victim of their acts? Muslims. As there is ignorance prevalent in this country, so is in other parts of the world. I cannot eradicate ignorance. I cannot change people's thinking and minds and all. We live in a civilized world. We conduct ourselves in a civilized manner, and we will continue to do that.
Khizr Khan, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
You know what the Indian and Pakistani governments have in common? They both claim to love the Kashmiris.
We can be duty-bound to ensure that every Kashmiri lives in dignity with equal rights
and the full realization of the right to self-determination of its people. The suffering of the people cannot be brushed under the carpet.
But the two countries that have fought 3 wars over Kashmir since partition in 1947 have a funny way of showing their love. India's president talks of equal rights, while human rights take a backseat in Indian-administered Kashmir. The country has at least 500,000 troops there. That's 1 soldier for every 25 residents. And those soldiers who were accused of acting with near impunity have been blamed for unlawful killings, disappearances, rape and torture. One study in 2012 found the number of unmarked graves in Indian-administered Kashmir stood at more than 6,000. And as of 2015, according to human rights groups, torture remained an institutionalized policy of the Indian security forces, who recently were accused of deliberately blinding Kashmiri protesters. Sadly, on the Pakistani side of the infamous line of control, things don't look that much better. Human Rights Watch has reported torture, political repression, and arbitrary arrests and beatings. Shall we brush that under the carpet, Mr. Prime Minister? Then there's the long-documented Pakistani support for a number of violent groups that, in the name of fighting for Kashmiri freedom, have ended up killing thousands of innocent men, women and children across Indian-administered Kashmir. Since 2005, for example, there have been at least 35 suicide attacks by armed groups. And as for Kashmiri freedom, as in self-determination, well, the Indians refuse to allow a referendum on Kashmir's future, while the Pakistanis want Kashmiris to choose between India and Pakistan, but not give them an independence option. Here's the thing, though. When Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control have been asked what they want, being independent of both India and Pakistan is the most popular option. Today, Kashmir still remains the site of the world's largest and most militarized territorial dispute. Yep, the governments of India and Pakistan just love the Kashmiris. Some might say they love them to death. A new book reopens the row over the controversial Gujarat massacres of 2002 and the so-called encounters, or extrajudicial killings which took place in the state afterwards, in which hundreds of Muslims were murdered. Based on secret recordings, the book points a finger of responsibility back at the then Chief Minister of Gujarat, now Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and his closest allies in the ruling BJP. The author, Rana Ayub, an investigative journalist, says she had to self-publish her book because no one mainstream would touch it. So is dissent being stifled in Modi's India? And are world leaders, desperate to do business in India, turning a blind eye? To debate this, I'm joined by Rana Ayub from New Delhi, and here in the studio by Sadanand Dhume, South Asia columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a resident fellow at the conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks both for joining me in the arena. Rana Ayub, your new book, Gujarat Files: Anatomy of a Cover-Up, stormed straight into the Amazon bestseller list, contains some rather remarkable revelations, transcripts of secretly recorded conversations about the alleged links between the Prime Minister and his allies and various instances of communal violence, extrajudicial killings, and yet you had to self-publish it. Why?
I was undercover in the year 2010-2011 when Narendra Modi was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and this investigation was carried right after one of my exposés landed the present BJP President Amit Shah behind bars. I came back with the transcripts. My organization, who I worked with, refused to publish it, citing political pressure.
You say your organization, Tehelka, which was the investigative magazine, they cited political pressures, you say, and yet they say today that they didn't publish your stuff because it was incomplete, full of holes, did not meet the necessary editorial standards. What do you say to them?
Well, the fact that the book is an international bestseller, it has got reviews from every possible publication citing it as perhaps the best investigative work in the country in the last decade. I mean, the fact that it has got great readership, not a single person who I had stung during the investigation has actually come forward to file a defamation against me or said that the information that I have written in the book is untrue.
Okay.
So I think that speaks volumes for the authenticity and the content of the book.
Okay, Sadanand Dhume is here. Are critics of Modi, such as Rana Ayub, being prevented from getting their journalism out? Is dissent being stifled? Are they being silenced?
I don't think dissent is being stifled at all. I think the very fact that Rana Ayub's book is a bestseller, the very fact that it has been very widely reviewed and discussed in India, both in the print and on television, suggests otherwise. Now, I don't know the sort of publication history, but I think it may be a little presumptuous to presume that if your book isn't published, it can only be for a political motive.
Sadanand, Human Rights Watch published a report in India in May called Stifling Dissent, in which it pointed out that the BJP government, quote, uses draconian laws to silence dissent, to silence their critics. Reporters Without Borders says the press freedom situation is worsening in India. Surely you would agree that, separate to the specifics of this book, there's a wider problem with dissent, with censorship, with media criticisms of this government?
So I would divide that into two parts. That in general, I would say that India has a freedom of speech problem. It has a problem partly because of the laws. It has a problem where any side essentially, especially on religious issues, if there's any kind of offense, people react by using the law and clamping down. Do I think on the larger question that freedom of speech has fundamentally worsened over the past 2 years? My answer to that is no.
Rana Ayub, what's your response to that?
It's got worse. In 2014, soon after Narendra Modi came to power, I wrote a critical piece in DNA, a very acclaimed newspaper. It was pulled down immediately after publication because the officials, the editors got a call from Amit Shah, who is the right-hand man of Narendra Modi, to pull down the article. Is this what we expect of journalism in this country? Is this not stifling of voices?
Okay, Sadanand, do you want to respond?
I mean, I think your viewers can figure out whether there's freedom of speech, whether there's dissent, whether there's freedom to criticize Narendra Modi quite easily. All you need to do is go to a website and check out the Indian press. I read 6 Indian newspapers a day. I look at the op-ed pages. There's absolutely no shortage of criticism. Is it true that on certain things, Prime Minister Modi could have spoken up more? Could he be leading the battle for civil liberty in a more activist manner? Of course, but that is very, very different from saying that there's no room to criticize him. India is not remotely like, say, Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey.
Rana Ayub, you went undercover for, I think, 8 months in 2010-11 to do these quote-unquote stings on various Gujarat politicians, security officials, high-ranking police officers. I'm just wondering, has anyone from the authorities asked for your recordings, asked for your transcripts? Have you had to hand them over to anyone in power to build a new case against anyone in the BJP?
On the day of my book launch, I made a public announcement that, you know, the SIT, the investigating team which was investigating the Gujarat riots, I would be more than happy to provide them the tapes and the transcripts, provided they are showing the willingness to investigate it in an independent manner.
You're happy to provide it, but have they asked you for it?
Newspapers have gone... No, they haven't asked me.
Sadanand, let me ask you this. Given so many Indians, the polls suggest a majority of Indians have no faith in the fairness of the judiciary and the court system. The Supreme Court Justice, former Indian Supreme Court Justice, is on record saying corruption in our courts is no secret, it is rampant. Given you have that situation and a lot of people in Gujarat, victims of violence, still waiting for justice, more than a decade later, isn't that why you need someone like Rana Ayub to go and do the digging, the undercover journalists, the recordings, the stings, because the judiciary is not getting justice for those victims in Gujarat?
I think that you could easily argue that the courts need to have moved faster. There were a bunch of convictions recently in one of the worst incidents of that violence. So I don't think that any reasonable person
but the foot soldiers, it's a classic case of the foot soldiers have been prosecuted, but the political masters, the people at the top, not really.
Look, politicians deserve the same standards as anybody else. Now, there is a process. Either you believe that the process is fundamentally compromised, or you believe that the process may be imperfect, but is not fundamentally flawed. And I think that's where you and I come down on different sides.
Well, let me ask you about the politics of it before I go back to Rana. In 2005, the US government, the Bush administration, banned Narendra Modi from entering the country because he was seen as responsible for, quote, severe violations of religious freedom during the Gujarat pogroms. In June of this year, Narendra Modi suddenly has the privilege of not just coming to the United States, but speaking in front of the US Congress and getting standing ovations from US legislators. That's a pretty big change of fortunes. That has nothing to do with judicial decisions or the truth about the violence. It's because he's the Prime Minister now.
I think you're wrong. I think it is largely to do with the fact that he is the Prime Minister of India. But I think that there was a very large role in the normalization of the West with Narendra Modi even before he became Prime Minister.
Because they thought he was going to win.
No,
and they want to do business with India.
Was the SIT report. So in 2012, there was an SIT report.
The investigative team of the Supreme Court.
Appointed by the Supreme Court, which said we do not have evidence to prosecute him.
Although an amicus curiae, friend of the court, said there was evidence.
In 2013, there was a court judgment that essentially endorsed what that SIT report, which had been mandated by the Supreme Court, said. I think that opened the door. It's certainly true that if Narendra Modi had lost the election terribly in 2014, things would be different.
Rana Ayub, what's your response to that?
There is no clean chit which has yet been given to Narendra Modi. In fact, the crux of what most officials in this book, tell me is the fact that most of them lied to the SIT. Most of them did not dare to speak to the SIT because they feared the consequences. The Home Secretary to the Gujarat government, Ashok Narayan, who was grilled by the same SIT which allegedly gave Modi a clean chit, tells me in this book that it was Modi who was responsible, who benefited because of the consequences of the riots, because he built an image, he gave a free hand to the rioters. He was not just inefficient as Chief Minister during the Gujarat riot, but what comes out of this book is that Narendra Modi was complicit for his role in the Gujarat riots and the fake encounters.
Okay, Sadanand, you've read the book. Do you agree? Do you believe the evidence is there? Does it bother you?
I question the credibility of Rana, partly because of the method.
Even if she's got tapes, which she's willing to hand over to the police?
Which she has not released.
Okay.
She still hasn't released them. So what we have is a transcript of
let me remind you, Sadanand, let me remind
interviews where the tapes have not been released. And actually, that's a great question. I would love her to release them.
Do you want to respond?
Sadanand, I think you are mistaken here. I mean, when you're talking about sting investigation not being credible enough, let me tell you that one of the convictions in the Gujarat riots happened because of a sting operation that was conducted in 2007 by the same organization that I used to work with. And the judge who gave the verdict cited heavily from the sting operation.
Rana, why don't you do the simple thing and put the tapes up on a website? What is stopping you from doing that? Isn't that a pretty obvious thing to do?
have approached every possible news channel in this country, every possible news publication, every possible website in the last 5 years to publish these tapes. I do not even have a lawyer. Tomorrow, if I publish this, I can be arrested for various charges.
Hold on, do you have any plans to put the tapes up?
It's easier sitting there in DC and talking about giving.
Rana, do you have any plans to put the tapes up?
I'm going to put the tapes up the moment the government ensures my safety and the fact that these tapes will be looked in an independent manner by the Special Investigations team.
Thank you both for joining me. We're out of time. Appreciate you all coming into the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.